If you opened your phone this week and saw people screaming that Dave Free just took over Death Row Records, I need you to stop right there, because this story is moving faster than the paperwork. The headline is explosive. The rumor is cinematic. The symbolism is irresistible. Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, pgLang, Snoop Dogg, Death Row, West Coast Power. Drake watching from the outside. It sounds like the kind of plot twist hip-hop would invent for itself if hip-hop were writing its own thriller. But once you slow the noise down and put the verified facts on the table, the story becomes even more interesting, because the truth is not smaller than the rumor. The truth is more dangerous. The truth is that people are so ready to believe Dave Free could pull off a move like this that one unverified wave of internet chatter instantly felt believable to half the culture. And that tells you everything about where Dave Free stands right now. Because this is no longer just a conversation about one catalog, one label, or one viral post. This is about how power gets recognized before it gets announced. This is about the difference between fame and leverage. This is about why some people dominate the timeline while other people quietly change the ownership map behind the scenes. And more than anything, this is about why the names Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, Snoop Dogg, Death Row Records, pgLang, and Drake keep ending up in the same sentence whenever the culture starts talking about who really controls the next chapter of West Coast influence. So let's separate the theater from the evidence. Here is what is actually confirmed. Snoop Dogg acquired the Death Row Records brand in 2022. That part is not rumor. That part is established. It was reported at the time by outlets including Pitchfork, and Billboard later reported that Snoop also closed a deal for Death Row's recorded masters catalog. In other words, Snoop Dogg did not just inherit a logo or a nostalgic story. Snoop Dogg secured meaningful control over one of rap's most iconic labels and major pieces of its music assets. That is the verified foundation. That is the part nobody has to speculate about. Now here is the second verified layer. In 2024, Reservoir announced publishing deals involving Snoop Dogg and Death Row Records, including Snoop's catalog and Death Row publishing assets. Again, that is not rumor. That is a documented business relationship. It shows that Snoop Dogg has been actively structuring the catalog, the rights, and the broader business around Death Row instead of simply sitting on a trophy and letting it collect dust. And here is the third verified layer, the part that gives the rumor its oxygen. Dave Free has spent years building pgLang with Kendrick Lamar into something far more ambitious than a music imprint with a cool logo. By Dave Free's own description, pgLang is built around systems, repeatable process, ownership thinking, and story architecture. He has openly talked about creating a system around ideas, making them self-sufficient, and refusing empty talk. That matters, because once an audience understands that Dave Free is not merely a creative side character in Kendrick Lamar's orbit, people begin to see him as the kind of operator who could absolutely sit in a room with heavyweight assets and come out with a serious deal. That is why the rumor exploded. Not because the internet is always right. The internet is very often wrong. The rumor exploded because it matched an emotional truth about the current hierarchy of cultural power. People believe Dave Free can do it. People believe Kendrick Lamar is attached to institutions now, not just albums. People believe pgLang is growing into a structure, not simply a brand. And people believe Snoop Dogg would rather align Death Row with a culturally fluent, creatively disciplined, West Coast-centered ecosystem than hand any part of that legacy to somebody who only knows how to market the mythology without actually carrying its weight. That belief is powerful. But belief is not confirmation. As of right now, I have not seen authoritative reporting that Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, or pgLang purchased Death Row Records from Snoop Dogg. I have not seen verified reporting that pgLang absorbed Death Row. I have not seen reliable evidence that Snoop Dogg transferred control of Death Row to Dave Free. And that distinction matters, because hip-hop conversations love to skip from, "this would make sense," straight to, "this already happened." Those are not the same sentence. In this business, one missing signature changes the whole story. So if the acquisition itself is unverified, why does this still matter so much? Because rumors do not go viral in a vacuum. They go viral when the culture has already been prepared to accept them. And the culture has absolutely been prepared to accept a future where Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar move beyond being artists and creatives and become something closer to infrastructure. Look at the last few years carefully. Kendrick Lamar is not operating like a man chasing visibility for visibility's sake. Dave Free is not moving like somebody addicted to public commentary. pgLang is not branding itself like a traditional vanity venture. Everything about that ecosystem feels designed to make the audience think there is always more happening than the public has been told yet. And that mystique becomes a force multiplier. It is one thing to have a fan base. It is another thing to have the culture assume you are 3 moves ahead even when no move has been publicly announced. Dave Free now lives in that zone. Kendrick Lamar lives in that zone. pgLang lives in that zone. That is rare. Most people in entertainment have to over-explain themselves to stay relevant. Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar benefit from the opposite dynamic. Their silence creates its own headlines. Their restraint creates its own mythology. Their absence from the loudest corners of the internet makes every real appearance feel heavier. Now bring Drake into this conversation, because whether people want to admit it or not, a huge amount of the reaction to this death row rumor is really about Drake. Drake's name keeps getting pulled into stories like this because Drake represents the clearest possible contrast between public dominance and institutional trust. Drake is one of the biggest hitmakers the genre has ever produced. Drake is still a giant. Drake is still unavoidable. Drake is still a reference point for commercial supremacy. But when people talk about Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, pgLang, Death Row, Snoop Dogg, and West Coast legitimacy in the same breath, Drake often gets framed as the artist who mastered presence while somebody else may be consolidating deeper forms of power. That is why these rumors sting even before they are proven. If the internet can credibly imagine a scenario where Dave Free is linked to Death Row while Drake finds out the same time the public does, that means the audience already sees Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar as men who may control the room while Drake controls the spotlight. Whether that perception is fully fair is almost beside the point. Perception shapes narrative, and narrative shapes how every future move gets interpreted. Once a certain storyline hardens inside the culture, every new headline starts feeding it. And the storyline right now is simple. Kendrick Lamar and Dave Free are not being watched like ordinary artists anymore. They are being watched like potential owners, builders, and long-game architects. That is a different category of fear. Because artists can be outstreamed. A hot album can be answered. A diss record can be countered. But infrastructure is harder to battle. Systems are harder to battle. Catalog relationships are harder to battle. Distribution relationships are harder to battle. Creative trust that compounds across years is harder to battle. When audiences start viewing Dave Free as an infrastructure figure, they stop measuring him by the same scoreboard they use for normal music personalities. And that may be the biggest story hiding underneath the rumor. A lot of people are still talking about Dave Free like he is just the man next to Kendrick Lamar. That is outdated thinking. The public record already tells a different story. Dave Free has directed, developed, executive produced, and helped build award-winning work. Dave Free has publicly described an operating philosophy for pgLang that centers systems, impact, and repetition. Dave Free is not framed by credible business coverage as a random background friend. He is framed as a serious creative executive and builder. Once that becomes the baseline, the leap from important creative to possible catalog strategist stops sounding far-fetched. And that is exactly why the Death Row rumor keeps traveling. Now let me go one step deeper, because this is where the conversation gets more useful than the rumor itself. Even if Dave Free and pgLang did not acquire Death Row, the fact that people believed it reveals a market hunger for a new kind of power transfer in music. The old script is familiar. A legendary catalog gets sold to a fund, a conglomerate, or a faceless financial machine. The rights get optimized. The songs get monetized. The story gets flattened. The culture gets told this is just how the business works. That script makes money, but it does not create emotional excitement. It does not make the audience feel history is being carried carefully. A different script is more compelling. A legacy asset stays culturally anchored while being modernized by builders who understand both symbolism and scale. That is the script people projected onto Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, pgLang, and Death Row the moment this rumor appeared. Whether or not the paperwork exists, the appetite exists. The audience clearly wants to believe a future is possible where catalog stewardship is not just financial engineering but cultural strategy. And Snoop Dogg sits at the center of that dream. Because Snoop Dogg is not simply a celebrity owner in this story. Snoop Dogg is the bridge between origin and reinvention. Snoop Dogg lived the early Death Row era. Snoop Dogg understands the emotional value of that name. Snoop Dogg also understands the modern business need to keep a legacy active rather than frozen. Every documented move around Death Row since 2022 suggests that Snoop is trying to turn memory into motion. That makes any hypothetical future partnership around Death Row incredibly important, whether that partner ends up being pgLang, another company, or a structure nobody sees coming yet. And if you are Dave Free or Kendrick Lamar, this is exactly the kind of territory where your names start gaining weight even before any official announcement. Why? Because pgLang already signals discipline. It already signals selectivity. It already signals a taste level the industry respects. It already signals that Kendrick Lamar and Dave Free do not need to chase every opportunity in public. So when something iconic becomes available, or even appears available, the public instinctively inserts pgLang into the conversation. That is what powerful branding looks like at the institutional level. Your name gets mentioned before your bid is even visible. Now think about the broader implications for the West Coast. Death Row is not just a label story. It is a territorial story, a memory story, a power story, and a legitimacy story. The minute people imagine Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar anywhere near Death Row, they are not merely imagining a business transaction. They are imagining a recentering of West Coast narrative gravity. They are imagining a corridor that runs from legacy icons like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre through modern institution builders like Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar. They are imagining a future where the West Coast is not just producing stars again but controlling frameworks again. And that is the part that makes every rival nervous. Especially when rival is not just one person, but an entire style of operation. Because the opposite model is loud, constant, and hypervisible. Flood the feeds. Flood the playlists. Flood the features. Flood the conversation. Dominate attention every week. That model can generate giant numbers. But another model is slower and colder. Build selective alliances. Protect the mystique. Let absence create gravity. Make every appearance feel consequential. Expand only when the move changes your category. That second model produces fewer headlines per week, but each headline lands with more strategic force. And right now the culture seems increasingly willing to believe that Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar are playing the second game at a very high level. That brings us back to verification. Do not confuse this video with an endorsement of every rumor swirling online. A lot of channels and posts are speaking about this as if the transaction is settled fact. I am not doing that. If new reporting emerges from authoritative outlets confirming a Dave Free or pgLang deal involving Death Row, then the conversation changes immediately and dramatically. But until that happens, the responsible reading is this: Snoop Dogg's ownership and catalog positioning moves are documented, Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar's institutional ambitions through pgLang are documented, the specific claim that Dave Free just bought Death Row is not confirmed by the authoritative material I have seen. That does not kill the story. It sharpens it. Because now the real question is not, did the rumor sound exciting? Of course it did. The real question is, why are so many people prepared to accept that Dave Free belongs in this kind of room? That answer tells you more than the rumor ever could. It tells you that Dave Free has crossed a threshold. It tells you that Kendrick Lamar and pgLang have crossed a threshold. It tells you that Snoop Dogg's death row ownership is now seen not just as a nostalgia play but as a live strategic asset. And it tells you that hip-hop audiences are watching for the next great transfer of cultural control with an intensity that most executives probably still underestimate. Because the next chapter of music power will not only be decided by who can make a hit. It will be decided by who can connect story, trust, assets, rights, film language, brand language, and long-term ownership into one machine. That is why Dave Free keeps sounding bigger than a job title. That is why Kendrick Lamar keeps sounding bigger than an artist profile. That is why pgLang keeps sounding bigger than a company description. And that is why a rumor about death row instantly felt like it might be true. Not because people are gullible. Because the architecture already exists in their minds. And if you are Drake, or anybody else who has spent years mastering scale without fully controlling the mythology around the room itself, that should concern you. Not because one rumor changed the entire business overnight. Not because Snoop Dogg necessarily handed anybody keys this week. But because the audience is now primed to believe that when the next major cultural asset shifts, Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar could be somewhere near the table. That is what power looks like before the press release. Power looks like the public assuming you are involved even when your name is not on the first document they can find. Power looks like your silence being interpreted as strategy instead of absence. Power looks like a rumor becoming believable because your previous moves trained people to expect one more move behind the curtain. Power looks like everybody refreshing their phones for paperwork that may or may not arrive, simply because your reputation has advanced that far. And make no mistake, if a real deal ever does emerge linking Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, pgLang, and Death Row in any formal way, the conversation after that will not be small. It will not be limited to rap blogs and fan pages. It will be a full-scale debate about succession, stewardship, regional power, catalog futures, and whether a new model is finally replacing the old one. That is why this rumor matters even in the absence of proof. It exposed the market's imagination. It exposed what the culture is ready for. It exposed who the audience already sees as a builder. And it exposed how fragile the gap has become between artistry and ownership in the minds of fans who are tired of seeing legendary music histories handled like sterile balance sheet entries. So here is where I land. The verified record says Snoop Dogg owns major death row assets and has continued structuring rights around the label. The verified record says Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar built pgLang around systems, impact, and ownership-minded execution. The verified record does not currently prove that Dave Free or pgLang bought death row. But the cultural reaction proves something almost as important: people no longer see Dave Free as a peripheral figure. They see Dave Free as the kind of person who could help determine where sacred assets go next. That is not a small reputational shift. That is a category change. And category changes are usually visible before they are fully documented. So now I want your take, because this is where the conversation gets real. If Snoop Dogg ever did decide to align death row with a next-generation creative and business engine, would pgLang actually be the best fit? Would Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar be the right stewards for that kind of legacy? Or does death row need to remain under a completely different kind of structure to protect what it means? And if this rumor is false today, do you think it is false only for now? There is also one more layer people keep rushing past, and it is a huge one. Death row has never been a simple, tidy asset. Even Billboard's 2022 reporting made clear that not every historically associated release sits under one neat umbrella forever. Rights can revert. Estates can control pieces. Brand rights, master rights, distribution rights, merchandising rights, publishing relationships, and future exploitation pathways can all live in slightly different places at slightly different times. That means any dramatic online claim about somebody buying death row should immediately trigger follow-up questions. Buying what, exactly? The brand? Certain masters. Publishing interests. Distribution control. A joint venture around future releases. A licensing framework. A creative partnership. Those are radically different deals with radically different consequences, and lazy internet discourse flattens all of them into one giant headline. That flattening is part of why audiences get confused so easily. Some people hear death row and imagine one vault, one owner, one stack of keys, one dramatic handoff. Real business is rarely that cinematic. Real business is compartments, carve-outs, side agreements, revenue splits, legacy exceptions, estate protections, and layers of negotiation that make simple social media claims sound way cleaner than the actual documents probably are. So if a real future arrangement involving Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, pgLang, Snoop Dogg, and Death Row ever happens, do not expect the truth to arrive as one cartoonishly simple sentence. Expect nuance. Expect structure. Expect a deal engineered around protecting specific pieces while activating others. That is exactly why people keep associating a systems-minded operator like Dave Free with this kind of scenario in the first place. And that brings me to another uncomfortable truth. The commentary economy is rewarded for certainty even when certainty does not exist. It is rewarded for saying, "It happened," faster than the market can say, "Show me the documents." It is rewarded for emotional resolution, not evidentiary patience. But evidentiary patience is where the most serious viewers gain an advantage. When you wait for the confirmed details, you stop getting trapped by somebody else's fantasy framing. You start seeing what is genuinely strategic, what is merely symbolic, and what is being exaggerated because exaggeration performs better than precision. That does not mean precision has to be boring. In fact, the precise version of this story may be the most compelling version of all. Because imagine what it means if the market has already crowned Dave Free and Kendrick Lamar as plausible guardians of major cultural property before any official confirmation exists. Imagine what it means that pgLang inspires that kind of projection. Imagine what it means that Snoop Dogg's stewardship of Death Row is now viewed as an active chessboard instead of a completed story. Imagine what it means that Drake's name appears in these conversations as the counterexample whenever people discuss who owns attention versus who may eventually own frameworks. That is not random gossip drift. That is the culture attempting to identify its next power map in real time. And if you zoom out, you can see why that power map matters beyond any one artist rivalry. Younger artists are watching catalog conversations more closely than ever. Managers are watching. Lawyers are watching. Indie founders are watching. Legacy stars who once assumed their only choices were sell to a giant company or handle everything alone, are watching. Every rumor like this acts like a stress test for the imagination of the industry. It reveals what futures people find credible. It reveals which companies feel culturally alive. It reveals which names feel trusted enough to carry heritage forward without making it look like heritage got strip-mined for quarterly revenue. That is why even a false or unconfirmed rumor can still function like a warning shot. It tells the majors that audiences are hungry for ownership stories with soul. It tells traditional executives that cool is no longer enough without credibility. It tells artist-founded companies that if they build patiently enough, the public may eventually start assigning them power before Wall Street does. And it tells the loudest stars in the room that the next era may not be decided by who trends hardest on Friday. It may be decided by who spent the last 5 years becoming the obvious phone call when something historic is ready for its second life. That is a very different race. So yes, be skeptical. Yes, demand proof. Yes, refuse to let dramatic narration substitute for actual reporting. But also pay attention to what the rumor exposed. It exposed expectation. It exposed appetite. It exposed a quiet consensus forming underneath the surface that Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, and pgLang belong in bigger conversations than a lot of people were willing to admit a year ago. Drop your verdict below, because this is one of those stories where the facts matter, the symbolism matters, and the future may matter even more than the headline. And if the next real development in this saga lands out of nowhere, we are going straight back into it, because the next move around Snoop Dogg, Dave Free, Kendrick Lamar, pgLang, Death Row, and Drake is not going to be treated like ordinary music news. It is going to be treated like a signal. And the people who read signals early are usually the ones who understand the industry before the industry understands itself.